Have we reached peak nanny state? Or, as the Chief Secretary to the Treasury Liz Truss recently put it, peak Banny State? Politicians seem to be sneaking in nanny state legislation through the back door, often in the face of hostile public opinion. Labour brought in a draconian smoking ban in 2007, despite its 2005 manifesto explicitly exempting drinking establishments that did not serve food. David Cameron made no mention of plain packaging in his 2010 manifesto, and the sugar tax didn't feature in his 2015 manifesto. These politicians violate John Stuart Mill's famous principle that people should be free to do whatever they like, provided they harm no one but themselves. So how did we get here? Joining me to discuss the Banny State are the IEA's Christopher Snowdon, Head of Lifestyle Economics at the IEA, and the author of Killjoys, a critique of health paternalism that has been adopted by governments around the world. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
And Rebecca Lowe, Director of the IEA's Freer Initiative, which works to promote a freer economy and a freer society. Hello,
Hi.
Rebecca.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, Chris, I want to go straight to you. I mean, how do you think we have ended up in this position where, you know, despite the fact that the public are not in support of these nanny state measures, that they seem to be coming in thick and fast?
I think there are a few different reasons, and a lot of them come down to kind of perverse incentives. I think ever since Tony Blair created the position of Minister for Public Health, which he did in the late 90s, that role has been filled with, generally speaking, fairly inexperienced but ambitious people. And as soon as they take on that job, they get surrounded by all sorts of lobby groups demanding that they do something about food or soft drinks or smoking or vaping or alcohol or whatever it may be. And the same is true at some other departments. I dare say Michael Gove at DEFRA also has endless environmental lobby groups campaigning for the kind of things he's been talking about banning recently, plastic straws, for example. And so if you're in that position as a politician, you have quite a big incentive to get your name noticed by supporting this kind of stuff, because this kind of stuff actually, although it might not be necessarily popular, is of interest to people. Everybody has a view about it, generally speaking. I do any number of particularly local radio station interviews about things that on the face of it are pretty trivial or very unlikely to happen. I mean, there's a huge argument recently about the meat tax. It was only a proposal in an academic paper. The government weren't proposing it, but everyone's got a view on it. Similarly, when I'm on the local radio, you know, if you get a couple of campaigners want to ban smoking in the street or in a park or something, they know at the radio station that they can easily fill an hour of people ringing up with very strong views on either side. So it gets politicians noticed. That's one thing. The other thing is that the public health lobby, including Public Health England, which is this vast £4 billion quango, their agenda is largely legislative. So they spend a huge amount of time campaigning for legislation, and they do that in various different ways via the media, but also with face-to-face meetings with ministers. A lot of them have all-party parliamentary groups, and so it's just endless drip from these groups that just eventually builds up enough of a head of steam that it comes to be seen as kind of inevitable that whatever policy they're campaigning for will happen.
Rebecca?
Yeah, I mean, I was just reminded when you mentioned Tony Blair, there's this famous story of him writing to Isaiah Berlin to ask about the difference between positive and negative liberty. Now, there's loads of confusions about this stuff, and usually when you're when somebody's not constraining you to do something, it's because you want to do something. But I'm now just suddenly thinking that actually this was probably just him trying to cloak himself in the language. It's nice to think he's interested in the ideas, but you know, looking for justifications to get to interfere in our lives. Because, I mean, you mentioned John Stuart Mill, and this is a great starting point. But of course, there's another kind of classic argument out there, isn't there, about freedom, and this kind of comes from Kant. It comes from other people who think that our sort of awareness of our real choices, what we really desire, what would truly make us free, are inhibited by our kind of current lower desires. Now, I'm not a big fan of this. I like to think of it as the kind of the Spice Girls approach. Just because I can't tell you what I really, really want doesn't mean that you're any better placed to tell me that myself. And there's also value, and this to my mind is where I get really frustrated by the nanny state stuff, is I think there's value in me using my own reasoning to determine why I make my choices. So sure, maybe like my welfare would be better maximised if I were to eat less cake. But I want to eat cake, not because I want my welfare maximised, because I want to eat the cake. And once we start to tap away at that, and once the state comes and sort of invidiously, particularly secretly, yes, if the state wants to inform us, that's one thing, but if the state wants to secretly try and change our choices using sort of sin taxes to discourage internalities that they think of as bad things, then I think we're getting into a really worrying position here.
But Chris, I mean, speaking of those negative externalities, do you not think there is an argument, though, at a time when, you know, the NHS will no doubt have its yearly winter crisis at some point soon? The fact that the tax burden's at a record high, surely encouraging people, nudging their behaviour through these sin taxes or other measures is a good thing for the public purse.
Well, it's an argument you often hear that, particularly with the NHS in its current state, which incidentally is pretty much the same state it's always been in, really, not as much money as it would like to have, you essentially blame the patients. That's what Simon Stevens, who runs the NHS, has been doing the last few years. You try and get people to overlook all the inherent problems with this vast leviathan of the NHS by blaming the people who need to use it. The thing is, you're generally blaming the people who use it least, because people who are extremely obese or smoke very heavily are not likely to be around for long enough to be using it long term. And it's interesting you mentioned the winter crisis, because it comes along every year in this country, not in other countries, but in this country. And it's the one time of the year when we stop trying to blame the smokers and the fatties and the drinkers for it. We accept during the winter crisis that it's the ageing population that is the problem. It's old people having falls, getting flu and all the rest of it. And that's the reality, actually, of the pressures faced by the NHS all year round. It is the ageing society. If there is any time bomb ticking beneath the NHS, it's the ageing society, and no one's really getting to grips with that. And it's not just the NHS, it's not just healthcare costs, it's also pensions and welfare and all sorts of other parts of the government expenditure. Now, this is a good problem to have. It's great that people are living longer, generally speaking, but we need to get to grips with how we, and not just us, how every Western developed country deals with having an ageing population. And we are not going to get to grips with it by blaming people who actually are least likely to live to extreme old age.
Rebecca, do you see any merit in the argument that there's a moral duty almost for sort of these light touch, what they would argue would be light touch rules and new regulations to try and move behaviour?
So first of all, I think it's important to make a distinction between the kind of negative externalities, the things that affect other people from your behaviour, that sometimes you use some forms of tax used to try to offset these things, I don't know, something like pollution or passive smoking, and the kind of usual sin tax approach, wine excise duty or whatever, that's attempting to move one's behaviour because it affects oneself. So I don't know, like lung cancer. And obviously there are some policy choices and some taxes which attempt to do both of these things at the same time. Do I think there's this kind of moral rectitude behind this? I often think it's, I'm sure they've got good intentions, but good intentions can come with bad negative consequences. So if you look at the way in which a lot of these kind of nanny state forms of taxation are particularly like regressive, there tend to be flat taxes. If you look at something like wine excise duty, once you add that to sort of retailer margins and cost of production, all those things, you're maybe, say you can only afford a £5 bottle of wine. About £4.50 of that or something is going into not the wine. Whereas if you can afford a £5,000 bottle of wine, it's still the £4.50. So it's going to be affecting you more if you're poorer, because it's a per unit cost, not unit as in nanny state measure, but unit as in vessel. And also it tends to be directed towards the things that poor people may like to do more. Now, they may get a load of pleasure, like I say. Like, just because you're poor or even because you're stupid, I think you still have the right to choose to do things. And this is partly, and this comes to your point about the idea of making a better society and having some kind of moral guidance behind it. I think it's super, super important in a good society that we're free to make bad choices and to choose not to make bad choices. One, because it's important for us. We're autonomous creatures and we deserve that. But secondly, because we want a kind of society that has virtue. We want a society in which we choose not to do bad things. Once we take that away, we lose all of these things like charity and like prudence. But we also lose some of our kind of decision-making power. We have a deliberative democracy. When these decisions are made for us, we lose something. We lose some strength. So I think it's unjustified, but I also think it's dangerous. It has unintended consequences of all kinds.
And that indeed was one of John Stuart Mill's arguments for liberty in the first place, that if you don't have it, then you kind of lose your ability to make decisions for yourself. But another of his arguments was, you're talking about making bad choices. Who is going to decide what a bad choice is? And how do you define it?
This is my point about reasoning as well.
So eating cake is a bad choice. That seems to be the implication of the current Public Health England approach to things, but clearly it's not. I mean, it's probably a bad choice to eat it exclusively. Okay, we'll probably give you that, but it's a trade-off like anything else, and it's not cake is not bad. It's good. That's why people eat it. They may have, if consumed in excess, it may have negative consequences, but that's for you to make the trade-off with. And the whole problem with this kind of paternalistic approach is it's one size fits all, and it has to be because it's a government policy. But people are not all the same. People do have different tastes and preferences. They live in different circumstances. They have, in the case of people who are very heavy consumers of things to a dangerous degree, it's all right saying they shouldn't do it, but you don't know what kind of psychological problems have led them to that, and you don't know that they're going to be any better off if you force them to stop doing it, or more likely simply make it more expensive so they have less money to spend on other things. So it's really about welfare economics. The whole point of economics, as far as I'm concerned, the maximisation of utility just means that you have as much happiness as you can have, and you can only do that if you allow individuals to act on their own tastes and desires, not on the taste of desires that a bunch of experts or doctors think that you should have.
Well, Rebecca touched on the fact that actually, if we look at, say, the sugar tax, for example, there's no evidence that sugar taxes actually work. They're intended to cut down on, our sugar consumption, etc. But actually, people are just they're just taking on that extra cost, right? And actually, they're entirely regressive because it hits the poorest disproportionately.
Well, sugar taxes are remarkably ineffective. In the places they've been tried, there's been quite a lot of studies now come out. And even the ones that claim that they worked, if you actually look at them and read them properly, they clearly didn't work. They're not even that effective getting people to reduce their consumption of fizzy drinks, funnily enough, let alone lose weight. But it's just a first step. That's where you've got to put yourself in their shoes. Jamie Oliver, for example, campaigned for several years very fiercely for the sugar tax, and the day the government said that they would do it, he suddenly changed his tune and said, look, we know this isn't really going to make any difference, but it's symbolic. And he was right. It's very symbolic, because what it symbolises is the government being prepared to start using taxation and, realistically, regulation in order to reduce people's sugar consumption because they think that people are consuming too much of it. So, yeah, it's highly symbolic. And so you get these kind of very ineffective public health policies. Most public health policies are ineffective, certainly taken individually. And the very fact that they don't work is used as justification for further action. So take this current situation with fixed odds betting terminals. Okay, it's been finally done and dusted. 5 years of almost entirely evidence-free campaigning about these gambling machines in betting shops. You would think, with all the hysteria around fixed odds betting terminals, with them being blamed almost exclusively for problem gambling, that their imminent demise would be celebrated. Not a bit of it. They moved on, the campaigners, without missing a beat, to complaining about online gambling and gambling.
So it's a gateway drug almost.
It's a gateway, because once you start saying, look, the government needs to do something about this and it's appropriate for it to use the law and to ban things and to tax things, then the fact that the initial policy doesn't work doesn't mean that you give up, let alone repeal that particular law. It just means that you've got to do more.
I also think there's a danger in focusing just on results or only solely on consequences to try to justify your means. This is where I differ from Mill. I'm not a consequentialist. And one of the beauties, I think, of On Liberty is that you can read it and ignore the utilitarian arguments in the sense of the strict consequentialist, only consequences based. Obviously, we take consequences into account, but only taking the consequences into account, end up treating humans as ends, but also determine, usually, particularly when we've got the state trying to use this kind of reasoning, put somebody else's goals ahead of your personal choices. So if the state is doing this and the end that they're aiming for is their determination of what utility maximisation is, whether that's more people living to a higher age, or the point is that that's taking away our decision from us, but it's seeing us as part of this big overall ends-based calculation which is made by the state. And I just find this idea absolutely terrifying. Like, I'm completely with Chris. I eat cake because I enjoy it, and that is a good reason. That is a reason that I eat cake, because I enjoy it. I don't eat cake to live longer or to get thin. And I don't want the state to be determining what my reasoning should be. I don't want to be part of some end-space calculation on the grounds of the state for their... I think it's wrong. I think it's unjustified. I think it's bad in a good society.
Rebecca's here for a good life, not a long life.
I'm here for me determining what a good life is. I don't think it's for the state to determine what good is.
Well, I found it fascinating, Chris, that you said in an interview, a few years back maybe, that in the next sort of line of attack by the Public Health England, or these custodians of new moral codes of what is deemed to be healthy behaviour, would next attack caffeine, gambling, and then you mentioned red meat as well.
Yeah.
And lo and behold, I mean, are you Mystic Meg? How did you get this?
I said that purely on the basis of history, because I'm very familiar with the kind of Prohibition era in America in particular, and also the Victorian reform movement in Britain, and this kind of Puritan movement that ebbs and flows through history tends to have the same kind of targets in mind, and it's always been moralistic. And I think it's very telling that now, under the umbrella of public health, we're also seeing a campaign against gambling, which isn't a public health issue in any real sense, and also red meat. So yeah, I just looked at what the prohibitionists moved on to in the 1920s in America, and it was tea and coffee and red meat and smoking. Of course, they did it the opposite way around to the way we're doing it now. They had alcohol ban first, and then they had the anti-cigarette league. Yeah. So it's pretty predictable, but I do think it's very revealing, the fact that I was right about that purely on the basis of what previous generations of Puritans had done. I think it's very telling that the people who portray themselves as being all about public health just so happen to be picking the exact targets of every other moral entrepreneur of the last 200 years.
It's really interesting. But, I mean, Rebecca, if we take e-cigarettes, for example, the evidence suggests that they're a pretty bloody good damn thing, actually.
That's right.
They're cutting down... If the goal, the raison d'etre of Public Health England is to, well, keep people healthy, stopping smoking and moving on to an e-cigarette, which is, study after study shows to be a lot better for you than your standard cigarette. Yet there is this movement against them, isn't there? They're trying to paint them as these awful things that are encouraging kids, when there's just no evidence of that whatsoever. Are we fighting a losing battle?
I think, first of all, I think Chris is spot on when he talks about kind of this puritanical attitude, this moralistic attitude. I think this somehow or other, and maybe it's because of the decrease of organised religion. You see the same people wanting to see the EU as some kind of moral arbiter as well. It's almost like people are crying out for some kind of rules-based sort of moral system or something. But I also think what kind of interests me about this is there's a whole swathe of people whose whole career is based on criticising the choices that we make in terms of what we eat, in terms of whether we smoke, in terms of whether we drink. And when sometimes some genius innovation comes along and allows us to do the things we like, but maybe makes it less bad for us, if indeed you count that as being bad, a load of those people are going to be out of a job. They're not going to be able to do their moralising anymore. What really, really frustrates me is when charities or other organisations that are claiming to be promoting the common good ignore evidence, they ignore progress, and they want to keep in their sinecure positions and keep claiming that things are bad. You see the same thing. Chris and I and Darren as well have talked previously about some of the points about sort of relative poverty measures. It almost feels as if there's a whole industry, a sort of misery industry, that is trying to claim that things are worse than they are. And when some brilliant, innovative, technological solution comes along and makes things better, they would rather stick on with their moralising attitude and claim that we're all doomed and that the state needs to fix this. And it's so depressing.
So a lot like the gender pay gap, for example, despite the fact it reached a record low this year, that was completely ignored. And
what a surprise. It's, the campaigners who've spent all their lives claiming that things are bad, vested interests.
So victimhood pays, is what you're saying.
Well, I hate to be a cynic, but I unfortunately increasingly see, the vested interests behind some of these campaigns. And
to be fair, there's nothing wrong with campaigning against problems, even if a problem is declining. There is
Absolutely.
still poverty in the country. There are still people, no doubt, dying too young due to the fact that they were misinformed or ill-informed about the consequences of doing it. So there's still room for people to be campaigning on these things, I think. It's just that they require an apocalyptic view of the world in order to get their policies through. You see this very clearly at the moment with the World Health Organization, which has completely lost its way. Obviously, there are still vast numbers of people dying in the developing countries from contagious diseases. But the WHO, in recent couple of years, has decided to focus on non-communicable diseases, and it is treating non-communicable diseases as literally an epidemic, and a preventable epidemic at that. Now, if you leave aside a few causes of death like suicide and violence, road accidents, all deaths are either from communicable diseases or non-communicable diseases. The WHO was set up very specifically to deal with communicable diseases, particularly in the developing world, and it did a very fine job with diseases like smallpox. It has now shifted to Western countries, largely because most of their donors are Westerners, people like Michael Bloomberg, who don't really care, as far as I can tell, about diseases like malaria, but they care very passionately about sugary drink taxes and smoking bans. And so they are treating non-communicable diseases as a horrendous epidemic and are behaving as if things have actually got worse. So they'll say now in countries like Britain, 90% of people die from non-communicable diseases. What can we do about this? Well, you can't do anything about it, realistically. You could possibly delay some of those deaths, but they're still going to be from non-communicable diseases, hopefully. And we should be looking at a country where 100% of deaths come from non-communicable diseases. So again, it's catastrophism, if that's a word, catastrophism. Just creating the idea of a catastrophe when things are blatantly, on every possible metric, getting better. We shouldn't be panicking like this about any kind of lifestyle behaviours or diseases in Britain. I mean, yeah, there are still problems, not denying that. There's still the odd communicable disease death. But we should acknowledge things have got much, much better. And
moving on to what you think government should actually be doing, because we've spoken about what they are doing, but in your mind, what role should government play in? So Rebecca mentioned, a little bit of freedom for that security and that keeping us safe, etc. But I mean, surely it's far too extreme in its current form, yeah?
It's not to be a mirror into our souls, I think somebody once said.
Do you agree with that, Chris? What role should government be playing in our, keeping us healthy?
Education in some instances, possibly kind of information, the mandatory calorie labelling, possibly. We can't do it inside the EU, incidentally, but that kind of thing I think is fine. It's not coercive, it's not particularly paternalistic, it's just about having an informed population. Other than that, nothing really. I mean, if you've got something like alcohol or tobacco that you don't want kids to consume, obviously you have an age restriction on that. Other than that, nothing at all. What the government should do is just ignore these pressure groups. They are actually really easy to ignore. In Australia, for example, there's been a huge push for the sugar tax. They're all saying, look, Britain's done it, these countries have done it. And the government just said a while ago, no, we're not going to do this. And it pretty much killed the debate. I mean, the campaign groups are still going on about it. But they know it's more or less a lost cause because none of the parties are going to do it. Cameron could easily have done that with plain packaging back in 2010. He could. Nobody seriously thought Britain was going to bring in plain packaging. He could have said, no, this is a silly idea, we're not going to do it. And it would have all gone away. Instead, what he did is he launched a public consultation, which made it almost inevitable that he was going to have to do it, because he'd otherwise be accused of being under the influence of tobacco lobbyists or something. So these guys, if you ignore them, they will go away. They are kind of like annoying children. If you just make it very clear that when you say no, it means no, then they will shut up. If you say no and then give in, then they're going to realise that you're weak, and it's worth for them to keep on pushing you.
Rebecca, you speak to politicians quite a lot. Are you optimistic that these health Puritans, will be ignored?
Depends on how much they like their Cocoa Pops, doesn't it? I mean, often people are perfectly happy to say, oh, sure, I don't think Darren should eat as much sugar. Don't think Darren should drink as much, etc. But then if somebody comes along and says to me, oh, Rebecca, you can't have your half bottle of wine tonight that you're planning to have with your steak, or I'm going to change your favourite chocolate bar. So Let's make the politicians eat the nasty sugar reduced food and then see what they say.
Yeah, test it on them.
Absolutely. I think they should all volunteer to be.
It should have to be in the Parliament bar for 1 year before it goes on general
Sounds good
release.
to me.
Yeah.
That's a really good proposal.
What I worry about is people trying to thinly veil imposing their own forms of reasoning on us. You even have these. We were talking earlier about these so-called libertarian paternalists who feel that it's consistent to be able to influence behaviour while respecting choice. And I think it's telling. I was reading a piece that Cass Sunstein, who's one of the sort of key drivers of this, wrote called "Why Libertarian Paternalism is Not an Oxymoron," and he says in it something about we understand behavioural theory, so we can steer people towards welfare maximising choices without eliminating freedom of choice. I just find this word "eliminating" hilarious. Like that's definitely what it's about. Let's not just take away their entirety of their freedom of choice. So hopefully we can show up some of those things, and we can point towards the value of being able to make our own choices on our own reasoning, which is essential in a good society, in a good democratic free society.
But in the meantime, clone Liz Truss and get on with it.
You'd probably have to have some standards and regulations on that.
Yeah, quite possibly. I'd imagine you would. Right, Rebecca and Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You can subscribe to this podcast channel on iTunes at IEA London. For more IEA content, go to our website, iea.org.uk.